Welcome to Overview of Inclusive Education Part 2. This is going to provide some information on the elements or defining factors of inclusive classrooms and schools. This part of the lecture includes just one essential question. What are the elements or defining factors of an inclusive classroom or school? And here I'm just going to provide an overview of some of the elements and defining factors and a few quality indicators for each element or defining factor. However, I want to be clear that this is not an exhaustive list of defining factors. How it is a well-rounded list with some quality indicators included. The information that I'm going to provide here today comes from a number of sources, and I just highlighted some sources here, although there are a number of other resources that define inclusive schooling. So I developed this from Creating an Inclusive School by Villa and Thousand, a book from 2008. The Principal's Handbook to Leading Inclusive Schools, which is a companion book to the book for this course. Creating Inclusive Schools for All Students, which is an article written by Julie Costin and George Theo Harris that's available on the Moodle site. The Swift National Technical Assistance Center for Inclusive Schooling. You can go to www.swiftschools.org to find out more information about the Technical Assistance Center, and also the New Hampshire Institute on Disability, which is a partner with Swift Schools. General education class membership and full participation is one of the essential defining factors of inclusive schools. And we look at students with disabilities as full members of the general education classroom. So if you think back to the first part of this lecture, I referenced the school that Jill and I worked in that moved toward more inclusive practices. And one thing that we made a point to do was to place all students with disabilities on general education rosters first. So they were considered full members of that classroom, just like all of the other students. Teachers assume shared ownership of students. So that meaning that the general education or quote unquote typical students belong to the general education teacher and the special education students belong to the special education teacher. In inclusive schools, we share ownership of those students. So it would be typical to walk into a classroom and see the general education teacher working with students with disabilities and the special educator working with students without disabilities. There's a shared ownership of students in that classroom. So I included the quote from Villa and Thousand in a book that just came out that says, general education teachers have specific knowledge regarding the strengths and needs of students with and without IEPs, and they assist and support every student in reaching their potential. So that means that general education teachers are taking specific ownership of these students. Again, they belong to that teacher just like they would the other students belong to that teacher. Students are afforded the opportunity to learn in heterogeneous groups throughout the day. So one thing we want to avoid is what has been coined the island in the mainstream, which would be students with disabilities inside a general education classroom, but then constantly grouped together in a particular area of the classroom or simply constantly grouped together with other students with disabilities throughout the day. So throughout the day, students with and without disabilities are provided opportunities to learn together in mixed groups. And that also access to a classroom is not based on academic or behavior readiness, rather instruction is adjusted for the student. And here really the main idea is that we don't need to say a student needs to be reading at a particular grade level in order to be ready to enter the general education classroom. We assume that if a student is not reading at grade level, that we're giving them quality reading instruction, but that we're also adapting some of the text or providing other options for text that are accessible for that student while they're developing their reading skills. So thus, the classroom, access to the classroom is not conditional. We are not for example, waiting for students to catch up, but that the assumption would be that they are in the classroom and we think about how we can include them first and foremost, as opposed to saying they have to show us that they are ready by meeting a particular reading benchmark and so on and so forth. Another essential aspect of inclusive schools and classrooms is co-teaching and collaboration. So some of the major quality indicators include formal processes for co-planning and problem solving. So Rich Villa, Jackie Thousand, and Ann Nevin are some of the most prominent practitioners and researchers in the field of co-teaching. And they also talk about the idea of regularly scheduled time to co-plan units and lessons. So what we see in inclusive schools is that co-teachers are often meeting together, they have common planning time, they have time to meet as a team and problem solve. Let's say, for example, they're having difficulty including a student in a lesson. There's time built in for them to talk about what those difficulties are and then try to come up with some creative ways to include the student in the lesson. Again, I'm going to touch on the second bullet point just briefly one more time, but a regularly scheduled time to co-plan units and lessons, we know that is essential. So in terms of co-teaching and collaboration, it is so important for the schedule to allow time for general education teachers and special education teachers, folks, to find some time to co-plan instruction. The third is shared ownership of all students, which really goes back to the first piece, but that when we're co-teaching, we are sharing all students between the general education teacher and the special education teacher. So it's not simply the special educator's role to come in and pull a student with a disability aside and work with them, but rather we're looking at a process where we are collaborating to work with and support students to be fully integrated into the activities, into the lessons that are happening in the classroom. The next essential aspect is academic instruction and support. And so this is really big in terms of what makes inclusion work. So some of the quality indicators for instruction include provision of standards-based curriculum presented in a variety of ways and accessible formats. So we really need to focus on providing text at appropriate grade level, reading levels, using different symbolic representations such as videos and pictures, implementing elements of universal design, which in big ideas means we're providing students multiple ways of learning the information, multiple ways of engaging in the information, and then multiple ways of showing what they know. So instruction is adjusted to meet the needs of the students. Again, instead of looking at the students as the object of remediation, we're really looking at our instruction, our goals, our objectives, our materials as the objects that need to be altered or changed in order to fit the students. Again, instruction provided in heterogeneous groups. Understandably, there are reading instructional strategies such as guided reading that requires some grouping based on similar reading levels. However, throughout the day, there may be many other times where we can use that heterogeneous grouping and mix students up. So we may have students in that reading group for 20 minutes with students of other similar reading levels, and then we're providing many other opportunities throughout the day for students to be mixed groups. And then instruction is provided in a variety of ways. So there's individualized instruction, pairs, small group, whole group. So students are allowed to move through these different instructional groupings. Along with instruction comes support. And some of the big ideas for support is that it's provided primarily in the general education classroom and allows the students access to general ed curriculum. It supports student independence and interaction with peers. So I put in as an example, an adult isn't sitting next to the student throughout the entire class or day unless absolutely necessary. So we're fading support in order to allow students to interact with peers, or we're supporting that peer interaction in a meaningful way as much as possible throughout the day. Also, peer support is reciprocal. Oftentimes we see what happens is a student with a disability may always be the helpee, and the student without the disability will always be the helper. And we want to think about shifting that perspective and allowing students to play both roles. So students with disabilities being put in a situation where they can also be the helper, and the student without the disability can be the helpee. The next essential element is behavior support. So many of our students with and without disabilities require behavior support. Some big ideas for providing behavior supports in inclusive classrooms is structuring the environment for students with specific sensory needs. Paula Kluth this comes from her book, You're Going to Love This Kid, and she also has a blog that summarizes the chapter where she talks about structuring the environment for students with specific sensory needs. She provides some really nice examples in terms of sounds and lighting that one may want to try in order to structure the environment. Using humanistic approaches to behavior that take into account student interest, that take into account student wants and needs. And then also the use of positive behavioral support approaches. The last essential element that I'm going to touch on today is the facilitation of friendships and developments of social skills. A few big ideas here are that specific social skills instruction is provided during lunchtime or a small group, and that we're utilizing intentional strategies to promote friendships. We focus on facilitating a friendship using things that the children are interested in, the students are interested in. Another element is that the school and the teachers promote an understanding of difference and diversity. This can be done through disability awareness presentations. It can be done in a number of ways, but that disability and diversity are highlighted in a number of positive ways. The last is that students have access to curricular activities with support. So many of our students with disabilities may need support during these extracurricular activities, but the extracurricular activities are so important in that they are where those friendships develop and oftentimes where the student can practice social skills. I'm going to very briefly cover some additional elements of inclusive schooling that folks may be interested in delving a little bit more into in future classes. The first is strong administrative support. In order to have a sustainable inclusive school, it's important that the administrator supports inclusive education. The next is access to communication. We want to make sure that students all have access to communication in whatever way they need it, including access to alternative and augmentative communication. The third is family and community partnerships. There's a significant amount of research that suggests that family and community partnerships are essential in sustaining inclusive schools. And the next is to make sure there's inclusive policy and practice at the school. So, for example, the placement of students in classrooms each year. At the school that Jill and I worked in San Diego, we had to develop a practice of placing students in general education classrooms in a thoughtful way. That's something that the school did not have previously, as many of the students were in self-contained settings, that we developed along the way as a method for ensuring that our students were fully included in those general education classrooms.